Anyway, the theologian we're looking at today, it's kind of an odd theme for today because we're going to be looking at Holy Saturday right before Christmas. So this is a different kind of enterprise. But the theologian we're looking at today is Urs von Balthasar, which, as David said last week, is one of the great names of the Christian tradition, right up there with Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt and Nicholas Ludwig Count von Zinzendorf, three of my favorite names. But Urs von Balthasar may not be very well known to you, but in the Roman Catholic world, he's like one of the most important theologians of the 20th century in the Roman Catholic tradition. And interestingly, he's also of great interest to Protestant theologians, especially if you look at the list of dissertations done at Princeton Seminary. Von Balthasar shows up in a lot of them. So Protestants find him to be very interesting, as we'll see as we go along. He was born in Lucerne, Switzerland, which is a very Roman Catholic Swiss town. Bart was born in Basel, which is a very Protestant Reformed town. He was educated in Munich and Vienna and Berlin. And in Berlin, he actually studied Kierkegaard. He said, "To my great misfortune, while I was in Berlin working with Guardini, who was a Catholic theologian, I read Kierkegaard, and it changed his view of the Christian life from that point on, that the Christian is supposed to mirror the suffering of Christ in his or her own life." And so this becomes a major theme for him. He's constantly thinking along with, and like Bart, over against sometimes Kierkegaard, which is kind of interesting. In 1929, when he was 24 years old, he entered the Society of Jesus. He says in his autobiography, he had no idea why. He just did. It wasn't like some family thing, oh, you're going to be a Jesuit one day, this kind of thing. He just wound up entering the order, and he fell in love with the spiritual vision of Ignatius of Loyola and the way Ignatius tried to transform European Christianity, actually global Christianity, by combining for everyone, not just for monastics, combining contemplation with action. And this became an insight that von Balthasar pursued for the rest of his life. He thought that the church, especially after Vatican II, was rightly engaging the world in action, but it wasn't rightly resourcing itself with contemplation in so doing. And so he said Christianity is in danger of becoming pallid and insipid because it's just becoming this kind of surface phenomenon and isn't plunging more deeply into the depths of its spiritual sources, especially in contemplating Christ crucified, which is a central element of Ignatius's spiritual discipline. So von Balthasar, for the rest of his life, is constantly looking for this combination of contemplation and action. And so actually what a lot of us are doing here at St. James is very von Balthasarian, like contemplative citizenship. That's a von Balthasar kind of thing, right, that David was doing. I'm not saying David was drawing from him necessarily, but I think that he's a very interesting person that way. He also then, during his Jesuit studies, he worked with a fellow you may not know, but he's very important, Henri de Lubac, his name is. And he founded a school called Nouvelle Théologie, the New Theology. And actually, the New Theology is really old theology. That de Lubac was responding to the sense that neo-scholasticism, sort of revised versions of Thomas Aquinas, were dominating Catholic theology, and they weren't drawing from the richer sources of Catholic theology in the early church, like Irenaeus, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus Confessor, these kinds of big people. And so de Lubac and then von Balthasar started putting out translations of, in French and German, and then studies of people like Irenaeus and Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus Confessor. So you can actually see translations into English of the studies von Balthasar did of these different figures. And what he loved about them was, and what de Lubac loved about them was, they focused very intensely on Christ, on the unique individuality of Christ, whom they see as universally significant. So it's this kind of paradoxical thing that you focus in on this one particular and its uniqueness, and that has this kind of radiance that saturates the cosmos. And so that's another thing he was looking for, is in that contemplation, contemplating the reality that's in this unique individual that's also at the heart of the universe. So he also, during this period, read Martin Luther, along with a lot of other church fathers. So he's very interesting that way. In 1940, after he became a Jesuit fully blown, he was sent to Basel to become the chaplain at the University of Basel, and Karl Barth was working there, right? So he and Karl Barth strike up an immediate friendship, and he loved Barth's focus on Jesus Christ, and especially on Christ crucified being the image of God, and the Christocentric nature of Barth's theology. And he wanted to do something similar in Roman Catholic theology. He called it a Christological revolution, that the Catholic Church, he thought, had lost its focus on Jesus Christ, and they needed to get that back. And so he thought Barth's theology would be a very important resource for that. And so he did a major study of Barth's theology, believe it or not, as it's very pious Roman Catholic, called The Theology of Karl Barth, which he published in 1951. And he and Barth were friends for quite a long period of time. And they would go on vacations together in the mountains and out in Switzerland and listen to Mozart. They both loved Mozart. And it's fascinating because in their talks with other people, they would say, you know, Karl Barth, von Balthasar would say to other people, Karl Barth's almost there. I mean, he's almost a Roman Catholic. If he would just accept the Virgin Mary and the Pope, he's home. And Barth's going, von Balthasar is almost there. His focus on Jesus Christ is almost there. But if he'd only get rid of the Pope and Mary, he's there, right? So that kind of tells you how close they were and yet how far away. So anyway, but you can see a lot in the reading that I have for today. You can see a lot of Barth echoes in there, but he also goes beyond Barth. In terms of the reading for today, this comes from this remarkable relationship he had with this woman in Basel while he was chaplain in the university. She was a Reformed in the same church as Karl Barth. She was Swiss Reformed, so she's Protestant, but she wanted to become Roman Catholic, and she felt she prayed her way into the Catholic Church. So whenever von Balthasar became her teacher and spiritual advisor, guiding her into the Catholic faith, which we would call Roman Catholic Initiation for Adults, RCIA, but this was before that was formed. and as he was advising her, he would be her director during Holy Week, and especially during Good Friday, during the 3 days of the Paschal Mystery, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. And she began to have, year after year, these intense experiences, not on Good Friday, beginning on Good Friday, but on Holy Saturday. And she had these visions of the Son of God's abandonment to death and hell. And he's wandering around in hell looking for the Father whom he cannot find. And von Balthasar was absolutely struck by this. He's like, well, wait a minute, we always focus on Good Friday and the cross, but there's this missing day in the church's calendar that everyone doesn't know quite what to do. Do you watch football? Do you go out for brunch? What is Holy Saturday? What's Holy Saturday about? What he realized, if Adrian von Speyr is right, if her visions are true, and so he begins to investigate scripture and the tradition to see if they're true, and he concluded that they were. If they're true, then the main icon of meditation for the Christian isn't the cross, it's death. It's when the Son of God is dead. Right? So the icon that von Balthasar wants Christians to focus on is not when Christ dies on the cross, although that's obviously included, but when it's dead, when the Son of God is dead. Of course, this assumes, and this is something that happens in the 19th and 20th century, this assumes that God can experience death, that the Son of God can actually be dead in some sense. And so that's what he's wanting us to pay attention to, and that's what the readings that I have for today are looking at, is what does that reveal to us? Why would that be important to talk about the day that the Son of God was dead? Well, he focuses, and this is the opening, and so he writes a book, I should explain this, he writes a book down the line called Mysterium Paschale, the Paschal Mystery, and it looks very much at the relationship of Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday, and he thinks without Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday doesn't make any sense at all, because the New Testament says over 50 times Christ was raised from the dead, right? Christ was raised passive. He was raised, and it was from the dead. So what does that mean? Christ was dead, and he couldn't do anything about it, right? It's really astonishing. When I first read them, I'm like, I never thought about that before. So he's raised from the dead by the Father, but he's dead, right? So he's in the realm of the dead for whatever that time is. And of course, it's a timeless time. So that's what he wants us to think about. And as he thought more about it, he really begins to see that the problem that we have is that sin leads to death. The problem that human beings have is that sin leads to death. And so death rips us apart in terms of what God intended us to be. And that problem has to be solved. Obviously, it's rooted in sin, so sin has to be solved as well, but death is the primary problem. So the opening quote, just to jump right into his thought, the opening quote gives us a sense of what he means. For death entering the world through sin, okay, tears apart the being of man or of humanity as God envisioned it. Neither philosophy nor religion can restore to the status of a rounded, meaningful whole this fragment of earthly life slipping away as it is toward death. And so the problem of sin is that it leads to this kind of death, right? So if God is going to solve the problem of sin, which God is going to solve in a very Lutheran Barth-like way from Balthasar, it's going to have to end with the death of the sinner, right? Where all is lost. And so he looks at it from the divine perspective then in the next quote. Looking at this from the divine perspective, if God wished to experience the human condition from within, and that's what we think the incarnation is about in many ways, so as to redirect it from inside it, and thus to save it, so God becomes human to redirect human nature in a different way, he would have to place the decisive stress on that point where sinful mortal man finds himself at his wit's end. And this must be where man has lost himself in death, without, for all that, finding God. And we do have this kind of notion that when you die, you'll be with God. But that's not automatic, right? So you can actually experience death and not for all of that find God. This is the place where he has fallen into an abyss of grief, indigence, darkness, into the pit, and that's a biblical phrase, from which he cannot escape by his own powers. So he's very interested in how God enters into that realm. How does God enter into the realm where God is absent? That's really interesting, right? And how does God enter into the realm where God would be at wit's end, where God would not have any resources of escaping, even though also then that would be reconciled. So that's, as I said, this is a very non-Christmas theme. And on the other hand, he says this is why the incarnation happened, right? So this is actually the goal for von Balthasar, toward which the whole incarnation is directed. And so he accentuates this in the next quote to highlight just how dramatic, and he's very clear it's dramatic, this claim is. He says, if without the Son, no one can see the Father, and that's John 1:18, nor anyone come to the Father, John 14:6, and if without the Son, the Father is revealed to nobody, Matthew 11:27, then when the Son, the Word of the Father, is dead, then no one can see God, hear of God, or attain to God. And this day exists when the Son is dead, and the Father accordingly inaccessible. Indeed, it is for the sake of this day that the Son became man, that the Son became human, as tradition has shown us. And so that he's, in this book, he goes back and looks all through the tradition, especially Hilary Poitiers, who said humanity would not be in heaven if the Son of God had not gone to hell. Right? That becomes one of his major signs that this is a realistic vision that Adrian von Speyer had. But I think it's really interesting that rather than saying, you're kind of loopy, you need some psychological help. Von Balthasar took this woman, she was a physician, she had no theological training whatsoever. He took her vision seriously and was absolutely struck by it, and then tried to figure out how it actually revealed something that was going on in the Bible that he hadn't seen before. So I think that's really quite impressive. And one of the ways he does it is by reframing, as we say, the incarnation, how the incarnation took place. There's a very famous passage in the letter to the Philippians. It's the oldest literary fragment in the New Testament. It's the Christ hymn in Philippians 2 that talks about even though he had equality with God, he did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, but emptied himself, taking human form and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Von Balthasar wants to ask, what was that self-emptying about? Like when the Son of God was incarnate, how did he empty himself? What did that emptying mean? And he thinks that, interestingly enough, it means that the Son of God let go of his God-given, if you will, because he is divine, ability to run his own life, right? So he let go of the power to direct his own life. That's how he became obedient. And so what he does is surrenders that, abandons that to the Father, right? His power of self-disposal, autonomy, we would say, and submits himself entirely to the Spirit, right? So when Christ is baptized and becomes Christ by being baptized, because he's anointed by the Spirit, he puts himself completely under the disposal of the Spirit, right? He's not acting as a divine human at that point. He's acting as a Spirit-empowered human being. And that actually matches the biblical witness. The biblical witness, by and large, does not talk about Jesus as God in human flesh walking around doing things by his own power. He always says, everything I do by the power of the Spirit, right? And so the Spirit, after he's baptized, the Spirit drives him into the wilderness and he's tempted by Satan, right? And so that indicates that he has in fact submitted himself to the power of the Spirit. And so he said, by letting go of the form of God, this is in the fourth paragraph, that was his, and so his divine power of self-disposal, he willed to become the one who, in a remarkable and unique manner, is obedient to the Father. In the time of the Son's abasement, the Spirit proceeding eternally from the Father and from the Son receives a primacy over the Son who obeys him, and by him obeys the Father. So the Spirit is the driving force of Christ's obedience, and he's so willing to be obedient to the Father that he submits the whole of his life to the power of the Spirit. So you can see this Trinitarian activity lying behind all of von Balthasar's thinking. He thinks without the Trinity, you can't understand what's going on in the story at all. But it's a very different Trinity than the one we're usually used to. So where does the Spirit lead Christ? Well, it leads him to Jerusalem, right? And it leads him then to the Last Supper, where he has a meal with the people who are going to deny and abandon him and betray him, which is already the beginning of his suffering then, about which he can do nothing, right? And then the Spirit leads him into Gethsemane, where his agony over what's coming throws him to the ground. It's really interesting. He doesn't throw himself on the ground. In Mark, he's thrown on the ground by his distress. And so remember, he's looking at Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday, so he's not going to do the whole life of Jesus. But what throws him on the ground is the beginning of the disappearing of God, right? The disappearing of his relationship to the Father. He says in the 5th quote, in Gethsemane, Jesus falls to the undergo, dash to the ground, the eschatological testing. Everything starts from within, in fear and the horror which isolates. This isolation vis-a-vis the God who distances himself, but has not yet disappeared, on whom Jesus calls with pleading tenderness, dear Father, Abba, yet no communication from the Father follows. So Jesus is experiencing, the Son of God is experiencing the withdrawal of the Father, right? He's not fully withdrawn yet, but he's experiencing the withdrawal of it, and it's terrifying. Because his whole life was lived in an intimate relationship with the Father, and now the Father is withdrawing. Clearly, this intensifies as he proceeds to the cross, especially when he drinks the chalice that the Father has given him. For von Balthasar, that's when the sins of the world are poured into his flesh. And so this is very Luther, very Karl Barth, that Christ becomes the sinner of all sinners and takes the sin of the world onto himself. And he can do this by his divine nature, divine human nature. He really does assume, he thinks, universal guilt. So the universal guilt of humanity is being laid upon him, so to speak, being taken on him. And that, of course, is intensifying the absence of God. It's intensifying the nature of the death he's going to undergo. This is also demonstrated then, the passivity, if you will, the powerlessness, the obedience of Christ is demonstrated by the series of handing over handings over that take place in the narrative. And he says it starts with the Father. The Father hands the Son over to die. Actually, in another passage, he says the Son hands himself over to die. Judas hands him over to die. Pilate hands him over to die. Caiaphas hands him over to die, etc. And all of this shows when you're handed over by the power of your enemies in the Bible, that's the wrath of God, right? So God is withdrawing from Christ and allowing him to be handed over ultimately to death in the place of a sinner, right? Or in the place of universal human sin. And so these handing overs for von Balthasar are the key to the Trinitarian divine relation. That behind Judas handing him over, behind Israel handing him over, behind Rome handing him over, the Father is handing him over, right? And so there's a contradiction there that the Son of God is being handed over by the power of his enemies, but there's also then the assumption that there's some sort of resolution to it, that the Father will act in such a way that resolves this contradiction. But it takes place by means of bearing the total sin of the world. I mean, this is an amazing statement because that was Luther's primary point, right? Is Christ takes away the sin of the world, no one else does. And here's von Balthasar completely endorsing that idea because he thinks it's Catholic, right? And he wants us to, Adrian von Speyer had these insights into the suffering of the Son during this process. And the third quote on the second page gets at what von Balthasar thinks is going on there. He says, it can even be said that no one can suffer being forsaken by God more profoundly than the Son, whose whole life was unity with the Father, whose meat and drink was to do his will. On the cross, he still does his will without realizing it anymore. With every fiber of his being, he clings to the God whose presence he no longer feels, because now in the name of sinners, he is to experience what it means to have lost contact with God. And so what we see on the cross isn't the losing of the contact with God. It's beginning to happen. He knows it's beginning to happen. That's why he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? But he's still clinging to him, right? There's still a relationship there. It's when he dies that the full extent of his identification with sin and death takes place, which makes sense, actually. You can't really identify with death until you're dead, right? So in a way, when I read his theology, I'm like, well, of course, but why haven't we ever said that? Well, we've never said that because it was assumed throughout the Christian tradition, God can't die. God can't experience death. The Son of God is divine, can't experience death. So it must be his flesh that died. It must be his human nature that died, but it could not be God who experienced this. For von Balthasar, as for Bart, God can die. It can not die as in disappear, but God can experience death. God can experience what it means to die. But in order to experience that, Christ first had to give up his form of God, which means his ability to dispose of himself divinely. And then he had to give up the Spirit, right? And so the very last act of Christ on the cross is he gives the Spirit back to the Father, right? And now he has nothing by which to direct his life. There's no connection with God whatsoever, but he does that of his own volition, right? So he gives the Spirit back to the Father and then dies. And that's what death is. When you're dead, you can't do anything, right? When you're dead, you don't have the power to do anything. And so we often think of Jesus as kind of Superman sleeping in the tomb for a few days and then, okay, I guess it's time to come out. But that for von Balthasar, that's just horrifically wrong. That means we don't understand why the Son of God became human in the first place. So he goes to the realm of the dead, which is already a very sobering place according to Israel, right? And so he goes with this Israelite vision. There's a really good description of what death is like in the book of Job, in chapter 10 of Job. Sorry, it's acting up a little bit. Job says, are not the days of my life few? Let me alone. He wants to die because he wants to get away from God. So Job knows when you die, you're away from God, right? God can't get to you, but then you're away from God, which means it's really scary. He says, let me alone that I may find a little comfort before I go, never to return to the land of gloom and deep darkness, the land of gloom and chaos, where light is like darkness. So the realm of death for Israel, and von Balthasar thinks this is true for the biblical authors of the New Testament as well, the realm of death is a realm of darkness, it's a realm of isolation, and interestingly, it's a realm of chaos. The chaos is intensified by what Christ takes upon himself, and that is human sin, which is chaos itself, right? So there is that, there's an intensification of what the experience of death would mean for Christ that is unique to him compared to any other human death. And here he's taking on his fellow Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who sees the death of Jesus as being the moment of his saving work. But his death is not unique. His death is like every other human being's death. It's just that he supremely surrenders himself to God's love in death in a way that then can make it possible for us to do the same. And von Balthasar just thinks this is completely wrong. And I'm not saying Rahner's wrong, but von Balthasar thought he was wrong. That Jesus' death is utterly unique. There's no other death like it. He's not dying like anybody else because he's dying as the Son of God. And he's also dying with the sins of the world upon him, right? And so it can't just be a death like any other, but it at least is like the death that Job saw coming, which is that it's a land, he's going to a place of darkness, he's going to a place of chaos, he's going to a place where light itself is dark, and he's going to a place of isolation from God and probably from others. So he says, though, what he then is experiencing is he's experiencing the reality of what we call hell. Like this is hell, right? To be dead, isolated from God in the chaos of death and the darkness of death. But hell, according to von Balthasar, didn't exist yet, right? Because hell is a place where the sins of the world are being judged and punished, right? And that didn't happen until Christ took the sins of the world on himself and died. Right, so Christ doesn't just descend to the realm of Sheol, which is what Job is talking about. With the sins of the world on him, he descends further than that and creates for the first time the reality that we call hell. I think this is an absolutely amazing statement, right? So hell did not exist until Christ died, until the Son of God died. And so what that means is that he takes upon himself the sin of the world abstracted from the sinners. So he takes our sin on himself, but that sin is now not related to Randall. It's just my sin, right, in itself. I've thought a great deal about whether this makes any sense. And I've talked to people, I have never been there myself, but people who've been to Auschwitz tell me that they can feel the evil in the place. Right? The soldiers who did what they did, the people who did what they did are no longer there. They haven't been there for many, many years. But when you walk in there, you feel the sin, right? You experience the sin that happened there. There are other places where horrific things happen. That's why they tear schools down, where 20 or so children are massacred, right? The place itself now has sin in it, if you will. I do think that makes sense. I mean, this is at least an attempt to understand what von Balthasar and von Speer are saying.
My brother was to Auschwitz when he was in the army in the 1960s.
Oh, really?
And he said the same thing.
Yeah, no, it's really quite uncanny. I've not been there myself to my great shame, but I've heard the same thing, that it really does. There is an experience like that. So that's a kind of a tasting of what the Son of God himself might have been experiencing, right? And so he says this in fourth paragraph from the bottom of page 2. In this amorphous condition, sin forms what one can call the second chaos generated by human liberty. And that, in the separation between sin and the living human, is then precisely the product of the active suffering of the cross. The object of the vision of death can only be the pure substantiality of hell, which is sin in itself. And so it's Christ's experience of sin in itself and the whole chaos of sin in itself that is the creation, if you can talk about this being created, of hell, right? This also means, though, because Christ is taking the sin of the world on himself, that when it says in 1 Peter that Christ goes down to the dead and preaches the gospel to them, this isn't the way the tradition saw it, a kind of triumphal entry. For instance, if you read the Divine Comedy by Dante, the very opening scene when Virgil leads Dante into the Inferno, into hell, you see the gates of hell have been smashed open, right? Like a liberation of prisoners. And it's like, well, that's when Christ bashed the gates of hell and went down and freed the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel from their captivity to hell and saved them, right? Well, that makes Christ an agent. He's going down to hell like a military, right? And he's going to use divine power to free people from hell. For von Balthasar, he's going down to hell with absolutely no ability to do anything about it, right? So he's passive, completely passive. And yet he's experiencing, as the Son of God, he's experiencing the sum total of human sin and the sum total of human death in its isolation from God and in its in the chaos, if you will, the second chaos that it forms. So that also means, though, that death itself never was without the light of Christ in it. Death itself was never this kind of utter, complete isolation. So in the paragraph above the one I read, he says, on the basis of what has just been said, we cannot avoid the following thought. Given that the Redeemer, in his solidarity with the dead, has spared them the integral experience of death as the punishment of damnation, so that a heavenly shimmer of light, of faith, of hope, of love has ever illumined the abyss, then he took by substitution that whole experience upon himself. The Redeemer showed himself, therefore, to be the only one who, going beyond the genuine experience of death, was able to measure the depth of that abyss. So that's why Calvin says, for instance, Christ descended into hell when he experienced the wrath of God against him on the cross and cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? But Balthasar says, no, he didn't experience hell then. He experienced hell when he descended to the dead with the sins of the world upon him. But he's the only one who experienced that, right? So he's not joining other people in hell, so to speak. He himself constitutes hell by drawing all the sin of the world to himself, which means that the work that he did will constantly radiate itself in the realm of the dead. That the realm of the dead isn't darkness. It's illumined by love and hope and faith even, because of what Christ did himself singularly. So the effect of this death has an impact on death, human death across the board, if that makes sense. So it's a very, very provocative vision of what's going on there, what's going on in this day. And so he says, though, that this makes what the Son of God is doing on Holy Saturday, or what the Son of God is not doing on Holy Saturday, what the Son of God is experiencing on Holy Saturday should then be the central focus of the Christian contemplation of Christ and of God. That this is actually the heart of the Trinity, and this is the heart of the work of Christ. This is why he became human. What he's not doing actually is he's not building his case on 1 Peter. Right? He's building his case on he's basically saying what happened on Holy Saturday. Right? What happened when the tomb was closed and Jesus wasn't dying and he wasn't raised from the dead. And he thinks that actually there are ways in which the way he builds his case is, and 1 Peter only comes in because he thinks the tradition has badly mishandled what Peter said, or what the author of Peter said. He looks at what the experience of isolation from God, what death looked like from Israel's point, what sin and death looked like from Israel's point of view, and what the experience of the cross looked like in the Christian tradition. So he's using the build up to the cross in Israel, and then the echo of the cross and Holy Saturday in the Christian tradition, and saying, if they experience things like that horrifically, then what Christ experienced had to be more than that, or else you're saying they suffered more than Christ did. So it's a kind of how much more argument based on what kind of suffering is created by human sin, especially in Israel, and then the insights that the saints have had and the co-experiencing of the cross of Christ, like Julian of Norwich had. And Christ's suffering must be even more intense than that. And he also thinks that these people were given by the Spirit the ability to co-experience the suffering of Christ in what happened on the cross. So that's how he builds his case. He's just trying to say that when the Petron author says that he went to hell and preached, I can't find the passage, and I can't remember if it's hell, but that was always understood what he was talking about, that he's not going down there as a victor. He's not going down there in triumph, because there's no victory, there's no power to win anything. He's completely lost. He's abandoned by the Father, and he's given up the Spirit, and he also previously gave up his ability to dispose of himself divinely. And so if anything's going to happen, it has to be the Father, right? The Son can't find the Father. And so what we have now is this, not antagonism, but this separation of the Father and the Son, that they're not one in this period, right? And so there's a conflict, if you will, or a contradiction in the being of God itself, in that the Father alone can act and the Son can't act. And the Son has been abandoned to the realm of death, right? And so then the question becomes, A, how is that problem going to be solved? And B, why did it happen afterwards? No, exactly. So for Barth, well, that's a really good question too. So for von Balthasar, Christ takes the sin of the world on himself, right, in his divine nature. But in a sense, he takes it on himself. And by doing that, he constitutes hell, right? That also means that when he's raised, he takes hell with him.
Yes.
Right? And so he's getting this idea from Revelation. In Revelation, Christ tells the church, I have the keys of Hades and heaven, right? And so Christ has the keys of Hades because he took Hades with him. So that means he has the sins of the world on him still. It also means that we can choose an alternative path. This is very different than Barth, right? He didn't agree with Barth's doctrine of election, that all sin has been elected by Christ and then annihilated. He thought that all sin has been assumed by Christ, by his divinity, but it's still there. And we have the freedom to respond to what Christ did, either by loving him or not. And if we choose not, we choose hell, which didn't exist until he did what he did. I think this is a really puzzling statement myself, but on the other hand, I can see why he said it, because again, of the eschatological horizon you bring up, that hell is actually the future of humanity. I mean, it's portrayed in the Bible as the future of humanity. So von Balthasar is right about this, and this is absolutely critical to understanding Christianity. The end of the world happened, according to Christians, on Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. That's the end of the world in the middle of history. So nothing's going to happen at the end of time that didn't already happen then. It's just going to happen in the world, right? So, but that means then that hell is going to be an option of human freedom in perpetuity for von Balthasar. He thought that was really important to say. On the other hand, he thought, in agreement with Barth and Gregory of Nyssa and Origen, the church was crazy to preach hell as a legitimate alternative, right? That what the church should do is preach universal salvation as our hope. Our hope is that all will be saved, right? Our hope is not that some will choose hell. Our hope is that what Christ did means this radiant universality of his work, all will be saved. But we can only hope that, right? We can only hope that. We can't claim that. And even Barth said that. You can't claim that. That's God's job, right? And for saying that, he was accused of heresy. Like Roman Catholic theologians attacked him for writing a book called Dare We Hope That All Be Saved? Because in their mind, we know that a lot of people are going to be damned, right? And we have to teach that. And so von Balthasar on the one hand says, we have the freedom to choose hell and will always be an option for us, but it's not an option that anyone is hoping for. What we're hoping for is that all will be saved. So he kind of has this interesting position, because Origen thinks everyone's going to be saved, right? And Gregory of Nyssa thinks even the devil is going to be saved. Barth pretty much thinks the same thing, but he won't see it. Karl Rahner thinks everyone will be saved, right? Karl Rahner was once asked, what if we actually nuke ourselves out of existence? What will God do then? And he says, well, that would be a horrible thing, both for humanity and for God, but grace would still triumph, right? So there are theologians, Rahner is the only modern theologian I know who actually comes right out and says it. But von Balthasar won't say that. So the hell always remains an alternative. It's actually could be chosen by people, but you can imagine why. Why would you choose that, right? So anyway, does that go to your question? Do I think universality should be preached from the pulpit? I think universality as the core of the Christian hope, absolutely. I think, yeah. So the Christ came to save sinners, and I am the greatest of them, you know. So yeah, I think that absolutely, and I pretty much hear that. I mean, I don't experience any place where that isn't sort of the grounding assumption. But I don't know what to say about just claiming that every rational nature will be saved the way Origen and Gregory of Nyssa do. I find that to be really beautiful, that God works good out of evil, and evil is completely engulfed by God's goodness and overcome by it. So that's my hope. As F.D. Morris, who's a great Anglican theologian of the 19th century, said, I certainly know how much human beings are capable of resisting the grace of God. He said, mine is nearly infinite, but I do know something even more infinite than that, and that's the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And if I didn't have that hope, I would be lost. And so that's what I would hope the church would preach. That I love that in Morris. And he got into enormous trouble and was accused of heresy by the Church of England for saying that. I mean, there's something wrong when people get into heresy trials for teaching the grace of God for the greatest of sinners. I mean, so it's really interesting what's going on in the church that we want to reserve the grace of God in Jesus Christ for certain people and not for others. And why are we doing that? I think that's a really interesting question. Like, could you see Adolf Hitler being forgiven? Could you see Joseph Stalin being forgiven? Could you see Vladimir Putin being forgiven by what God did in Christ as the rockets are raining down on Ukraine? Well, if von Balthasar is right, yeah, you have to. If you can't hope for him, you can't hope for anybody. But the other thing is I just want to get this out, what is at stake in all of this? And in an interesting way, in the very last paragraph, von Balthasar is coming at a very similar idea that Barth had, which is God is not absolute power, but absolute love. But he's coming at it from a very different direction. And that is love is self-abandoning love. Right? Love gives itself away in abandon. So what Christ did was he gave his divine equality with God away by becoming human. And then he gave the Spirit away, right, to the Father when he died. And the Father restored all those things to him in the resurrection by the Spirit. So the Spirit reunites the Father and the Son, raises the Son from the dead, gives him his divine power back, gives him his divine glory back, but only because he abandoned himself to the Father, completely, unreservedly abandoned himself so that he could do nothing about it, right? And so in the last paragraph, this is why the death of Christ is the Christ in the realm of the dead is the icon of the invisible God. He says, what is at stake, at least in the perspective of death, is an altogether decisive turnabout in the way of seeing God. God is not in the first place absolute power, but absolute love. And his sovereignty manifests itself not in holding on to what is its own, but in its abandonment. All of this in such a way that this sovereignty displays itself in transcending the opposition known to us from the world between power and impotence. And that's very similar to what Barth says. The God is the act of love and freedom, and therefore has in God's self, in the unity of that nature, power and impotence. And so the Son can be impotent because the Son is the self-abandoning love of God. I think that really that's what's at stake for him in focusing on Holy Saturday, is the self-abandoning love. And that Christ himself didn't hold anything in reserve. I think that's really quite something. Anyway, thank you for coming out this morning and for looking at death on a beautiful Sunday day. Thank you.